Do you have a really mean person living in your head, criticizing you, putting you down, saying the cruelest things on a daily basis? A voice that you can't seem to shut down no matter what you do, it's just always there. Today, we're going to spend time understanding that voice, the reflexive, protective voice of the inner critic. Welcome. I'm your co host, Jennifer Wallace, and this is Trauma Rewired, the podcast that teaches you about your nervous system, how trauma lives in the body, and what you can do to heal. I'm a neurosomatic intelligence educator and a practitioner that bridges the intelligence of your nervous system and your sacred spaces.
And I'm Elizabeth Kristoff. I'm the founder of brainbase.com, an online community where we train the nervous system for resilience, trauma resolution, and behavior change. And I'm also the founder of Neurosomatic Intelligence Coaching Certification. So we are diving into the distinguishing characteristics of CPTS, and today we're exploring the inner critic. Big picture, when we talk about the inner critic, we're really just talking about that voice inside of our head that judges us, that criticizes us, that demeans us. And it doesn't matter if that criticism is objectively justified or just out of the blue about everything that we do, about our body, about the way we talk, about all of the ways that we interact in the world. And having a highly active inner critic voice can really take a toll on our emotional well being, on our self esteem over time. But what I really want us to explore today is we're going to look at this as not really the deep beliefs we have about ourselves, but reframing it to understand that this is part of a trauma response. This is a reflexive response when we're triggered, and that it serves a protective purpose. And that's what makes it part of complex trauma.
It's really harsh. I mean, we're not talking about the slap on the wrist that you might give yourself or that we get given by society, right? Because we all have an inner critic. That is normal. That is tribal. It's rooted in community. Think of when a child gets a timeout, right? That's to ensure that this child learns a lesson. Like, if I do this, I could get left from my herd. I could get kicked out of the tribe. But with the inner critic, the voice gets so loud and so big. And it says things like, you're ugly, you are stupid, you're fat, there's something wrong with you. And it's on repeat. You're different from other people. You're bad, you're weak, you're needy, you're too much, you're too sensitive, you'll never be loved. So, for someone who's experiencing CPTS, this voice is so critical and so mean. It goes far beyond just that slap on the wrist that I'm talking about that you might get from society, be like, oh, I shouldn't do that again. It just spirals into something so much more severe.
Yeah, there's definitely a difference between normal self criticism, which we all have a little bit of, and the experience of having complex developmental trauma. And the biggest differentiator is really we're looking at the impact of that on the nervous system. There's an extreme dysregulation that comes for someone with CPTS when you have that very loud, pretty abusive voice inside of your head, and then how your body responds to it. There's a reaction inside the nervous system. Our nervous system starts to move into one of our F responses, into a reflexive protective response. And that dysregulation can keep happening. So then we're getting driven into these chronic cycles of dysregulation. And with CPTS, it can also then trigger into the other components of CPTS that we've talked about, the emotional flashbacks, the ones we'll talk about later, the toxic shame. So it's this cascade effect, and it's ongoing. And then there's real impacts on the health of your nervous system, on how your nervous system is perceiving the world because you're in that high threat state, and then what's happening in your body and your health outcomes because of that.
And it's like you were saying, like having inner self criticism is part of being human. But with complex trauma, this is not self evaluation. This is a reflexive trauma response, linking back to an attachment wound from neglect or abuse. And it gets very disproportionate to the present day situation. And in fact, this is one of the, I think, one of the ways that I find awareness in my inner critic and in some of the other CPTS distinguishers that we're going to get into later is that I can start to notice that my reaction to myself is way disproportionate to what's actually happening. It's just like the feelings in an emotional flashback. They're huge and overwhelming, and they don't correspond to what's actually happening at the level of the self abuse and the internal criticism. It doesn't match the reality of the situation. It's far more severe. And cognitively, we can understand that this isn't true, that we know that we are not fatally flawed. But in the moment of a trauma reaction, that knowing it's not available to us. And the only thing that we know is that we are experiencing this in our bodies.
Yep. And I want to break down a little bit of the neuro here because I think this helps people to understand that this truly is a reflexive trauma response, not necessarily part of your higher order thinking systems. It's not really a deep core belief about who you think you are. This voice doesn't live in those areas of the brain, right? We have parts of our cerebral cortex, our prefrontal cortex, where our ideas and beliefs about who we are and about the world live at a cognitive level. This reaction is not part of that, right? When sensory information comes in to the system, there's kind of, very broadly speaking, two different routes that it can take. The sensory information comes in through the peripheral nervous system and makes it up to the brain into the limbic system, where your amygdala, your thalamus, your hippocampus plays a role in that, in deciding the threat level of this stimulus coming in, whether that's social stimulus or physical stimulus, information about the environment around you, signals from inside of your body. All of it goes up through that route. And then if at that point the amygdala especially decides this is unsafe, this warrants a threat response, then that information, those sensory signals, are just routed right back into your survival mind, into your brainstem, and an reflexive trauma response begins. And if it's safe, then that information can make it up to your frontal lobe and be processed cognitively before coming back down to the amygdala and then having the reaction occur in the body. And when we're talking about the inner critic voice, this is initiated when we get triggered into a trauma response. So it's not part of the reaction that involves the frontal lobe. It's part of the reaction that is a reflexive trauma response. It's part of that low road response, the fear circuitry that doesn't involve our higher order thinking systems. So, just for a minute, I want people to think about that, because when we hear that voice, it's not really coming from our cognitive, logical, rational mind. We don't really believe that about ourselves. It is instinctive, reflexive. It's just a loop that's playing to try to protect us when we get thrust into that trauma response.
And it's really hard to not believe that voice when that's your chronic living situation, when that's how you're experiencing the world. But, as Elizabeth's talking about higher order systems of thinking, for that to be turned on, for you to be activated and living from that place, you can't be in survival mode. You can't have the harsh inner critic and be performing with your executive functioning at a high level, because you can't jump and stand still at the same time. And when you're in a reflexive trauma response, you're gone into survival patterns. If you're being thrust into the throes of the inner critic and say toxic shame, you've been hijacked by those nervous system survival patterns. You have no clue sometimes, like your body is responding to a threat without your consent. That's the reflexive nature of it. And in regards to those reflexive F responses, let's explore the fawn trauma response for a moment, or its relationship here to the inner critic. So, to understand fawn is to understand that fawn propels us to engage socially with the threat, and it can often be misinterpreted as a personality trait. From an NSI perspective, fawn is a behavioral adaptation. It's a response based on the attachment need for survival. The trigger is often rooted in connection or is relationally based. It elicits a heightened sympathetic activation in the nervous system, right? That racing heart, tension in the body, bracing in the muscles. You could also experiencing shifts in your breathing. And because of our need to secure connection, and without the awareness of our fawn behaviors, they can easily lead into dishonesty, manipulation, self harm, and this deep unconscious resentment of not being able to uphold our own boundaries. Enter the inner critic. And it's these loops that are sometimes unconsciously wildly dangerous that we have on repeat. And every time we fawn, we break our own boundaries. And the person we're fawning at breaks our boundaries as well. And so a normal response that might come could be rage or anger. And it really could lead to illness in the body because as fawning becomes a lifestyle, that boundary is being all the time broken. It's being suppressed, that natural anger and rage. And so inflammation is going to happen in the body, adrenaline. And over time, diseases like autoimmune, thyroid, there's like physical deteriorations of the thyroid because of the constriction. It wears down over time, and it has a lot to do with repressing the truth, right? With NSI and working through the nervous system, we are uncoupling that expression of truth to the threat, to the social threat.
Yeah, I think fawn is a beautiful example there because it is like it's a behavior. We're moving into a behavior. We're moving toward the threat, but it's still a reflexive response. It's still not coming from like a cognitive decision. I want to break my boundary. I want to engage with this person and experience all of this. Like, no, it's happening at that survival level. It's kind of like when you examine the neurology of other reflexes, you can think of it like when you get a sensory signal to like you have an itch, and then you don't have to cognitively think about making your body move and doing the things to scratch and alleviate it. As soon as you experience that sensory information, parts of your motor cortex get activated, parts of the brain that plan movement. And so you experience the itch, and then your nervous system begins to engage in the planning of the behavior that'll alleviate the itch. And those are really hardwired. They're linked together. And self criticism can be really similar. When you experience the social threat, that inner critic loop just gets activated. The brain automatically creates the behavior you need, which is the self criticism, to alleviate the itch. And this is really true from my own experience. It can sound really conceptual, but to give a real life example, something might happen that will trigger me. And reflexively, I experience the outputs in my body, maybe the inflammation or the racing heart or my throat closes up. But at the same time, and this might have nothing to do with the trigger that I experienced. Maybe the trigger was just a sound or somebody's facial expression or something very small in my environment. The thought loops will begin about my body, about my work, about the way that I'm showing up in the world. And they're the same old loops that played from way back when, but they just get activated with that trauma response, even though it might not seem to have anything to do with the trigger. And I can know, oh, I'm pushed into a trauma response because these old tapes are playing.
I think it's like this with so many of the components of complex trauma and shame we're going to get into next in the next conversation, but it's the same kind of lens, the same filter gets turned on, because it's not just like, oh, it's the inner critic say around this podcast if something comes up. It's like my house, the laundry, the car, I'm not good at anything anymore. So, and that's another way that I can tell that things have gotten disproportionate, because I'm not just checking myself on something that I maybe like dropped the ball or there was a mistake happen in relation to, say, this podcast. It then goes on to everything else in my life. I suck and I'm terrible at it. And it is years of my life, decades I spent time in the inner critic, really believing that that's who I was, that I was this unloving, unworthy, terrible, bad person that didn't deserve anything, literally nothing. And what I learned through regulating my nervous system was, like Elisabeth was saying, like, that's not true. Those are not my core beliefs. That is now through a lens shift that my brain is experiencing, and I'm not in my higher order systems of thinking. I'm not able to jump when I'm being like, it's not even standing still. It's like in the fetal position on the ground.
Yeah, totally. No jumping and fetal positioning at the same time. Um, yeah, and these come from most of the time patterns that are developed during development, right? So whose voice even is that, right? Like where do these thoughts even come from? And we want to remember with all reflexive trauma responses, they're protective. And at the root of this is an attachment wound, right? It's our fear of social loss. We have spent a lot of time exploring how much social connection is necessary for our survival, especially as infants, as young children. We need our primary caregivers, we need our herd. And many children adapt to an environment where they're not getting those needs met by developing this really strong self-criticism, right? They live in this high stress environment. Maybe there's abandonment, maybe there's actual abuse, and they adapt to it with perfectionism. Right? This can come from passive abandonment of neglect or active abandonment of abuse. And that climate, that developmental water that they're swimming in, forces their identity to develop in a way, really forces their nervous system, their unique neuromatrix, to cultivate these dynamics of perfectionism and threat. And so you become really hypervigilant about making yourself perfect in all these different ways to keep your social connections met and to try to get the care that you need. And then you're doing that so that your parents, your primary caregivers, will be safe, will be loving. But that doesn't happen because usually when we change ourselves, it doesn't change the other person. It doesn't actually change the environment. We just don't recognize that as kids. So we keep trying and we keep failing at it. And so the voice becomes more hypervigilant about that perfectionism. It becomes stronger, it becomes louder. And Pete Walker compares this to soldiers that are in combat for a long time, right? It's the same thing with a little kid. They get locked into this hypervigilance and this sympathetic nervous system arousal, trying to relieve the abandonment, trying to get the care that they need. And it just keeps compounding on itself because you keep trying harder and it keeps not happening. And then you try harder and it keeps not happening. And the voice gets louder and becomes a more well worn path.
For children, I mean, they just internalize everything. Their brains aren't capable of having the altitude that we often have as adults when we're going back into our childhood experiences, back and through our developmental trauma and starting to heal things and getting this other level of understanding about the way things were when we grew up, and maybe even why our parents are the way that they are, and having a little bit more, grace is something that's going to come up here later on this podcast. But the brain and the nervous system is going to respond to threat and perceived threat the exact same way. So if a young developing brain is perceiving threat, perceived neglect, or abandonment, like Elisabeth was talking about, the priority is still attachment. Not only attachment, but attachment means literal survival. And so, how is a tiny baby going to feed and shelter and clothe themselves, right, without an adult? And so, the prioritize it, well, they can't, right? And so, we are going to prioritize survival, and the lack of brain development will only lead into the feeding of like, this is all my fault, right? Because children cannot self regulate until the ages of 3.5 or 4 years old, which happens to also coincide with the long term memory being able to be laid down in the brain as well. And so, all of those little years, these perceived knowings, they get stored in our bodies, and so that those reflexive responses of trying to change really begin with the thought loops of there's something wrong with me, and then we start performing in all sorts of different ways to try and secure that connection. And then we figure out, okay, like Elizabeth said, maybe I'm going to go into perfectionism, maybe I'm going to, the question sort of becomes more of like, how do I need to change myself to stay safe physically, socially, and emotionally? And so if you grew up, so we've already talked about Fawn. So say you grew up with this Fawn response getting deeply well wired. Maybe your parents, your primary caregivers are fawners. You might start to learn to quantify love based on politeness. And then you value politeness over your truth. And then maybe you learn that you get rewarded when you control your body versus experiencing the truth of your body. Whereas like manners are saying something like, I see you, I respect you, and thank you, I honor you, right? Those are manners versus I have to do something with my body that I don't want to do, like a forced hug, forced smiles, forced hellos, right? With children, we need to let them learn how to negotiate their boundaries for their own felt sense of internal safety, because the truth of our bodies, it sometimes makes people uncomfortable. And that's what a lot of people, like you're going to hear later on in season 4, when it comes to this, it could be lifestyle, it could be social systems, that could be racism, right? People who experience racism in their bodies and are in a different skin color than the dominant culture, they could experience Fawn on different levels just because of the truth of the body being the experience of making somebody uncomfortable. And with your primary caregivers, if your emotions are too big, if you sense that your emotions get your parents overwhelmed, then you might say to yourself, like, they can't handle me when I'm like this. So I'm going to shut this down. I'm going to play small. I'm going to hide myself. And Gabor Mate says, when secure attachment is threatened, we choose security over authenticity, right? So even think about that. When the child has to develop in that way, they don't understand how to express themselves in a true way. And you can see how shame starts to come into this and get really exaggerated and hypervigilant. And it can start to play itself out in future relationships when we're adults. Like that emotion can get triggered so easily when we feel like our connection with another person is in danger.
Yeah, that inner criticism can show up so much. It really like hit me what you were saying about like the somatic experience in the body and those that memory of like this feeling is not safe in my body, and then having to move into that inner criticism to try to change even how your body is expressing emotions, experiencing the world. It's very layered and it creates a real loop. It's an effect on the body that keeps us in a trauma response, and that's the kind of the thing about these 5 distinguishing characteristics is that we do need to find a way to break these loops because they are outputs of the nervous system because of the dysregulation, but they're also inputs in a way, and then they create more dysregulation. And so when I have this inner critic voice get triggered and activated, it's not only a, a response of the dysregulation of the trigger, but now it's creating more dysregulation in my body by having that harmful inner dialogue. And that is going to lead to the activation of my shame response at a really physiological level. We'll talk about toxic shame in a minute. or on the next episode, but it's going to create that response. It's going to create bracing and muscle tension and racing heart, or maybe freeze and shut down. So it just keeps perpetuating itself. Then as you get triggered, then the inner critic voice gets louder, then it creates more dysregulation, then the inner critic voice gets louder. And so there's got to be a way to interrupt that cycle.
And freeze is so interesting too because a lot of people associate with freeze as their like most common trauma response or like the most deeply worn path of their reflexive Fs. And it's so misunderstood in a way because freeze is intended to be an acute trauma response. It's supposed to be short in duration, right? It's when that pause moment. Think of the animal body, right? The animal, the little possum is out there doing its thing, and then here comes a cat, and it's just like boom, it freezes, right? It doesn't want to be seen, and that's what's happening for us. And it's this moment to make a decision: am I going to fight, or am I going to run away? But what happens is, like in a chronic situation with freeze, and freeze might look like anxiety, depression, fatigue, shutdown, overwhelm, migraines, neuroticism, dissociation is often attached to freeze. You often get freeze, shame, and dissociation kind of all lumped in together, just sort of running their cycles interwovenly. And this this level of overwhelm and shutdown, it is a protective output of a nervous system under chronic stress or too much stimulus, right? That bucket is overflowing, and it could really lead into further immobility, into flop situation, right? Into a collapse immobility when escape is not possible. And then you might experience fainting, fatigues, blackouts, dissociation once again. And so, yeah, am I good there? Trying to think of where I'm at in
Yeah, I
my
think
my
that's just it. It's just it compounds, right? All of these characteristics, they create more trauma responses, and those trauma responses compound to bring more of the distinguishing characteristics about. And so one of the things I think is really important to think about is self compassion would be the opposite of the inner critic, right? The inner critic is really hard on us. Self compassion is looking at ourselves with curiosity and understanding for why things might be difficult, for what's going on for ourselves, and just having compassion for the experience that we're having. And we did an episode not too long ago with Amanda Smith where we talked about the neurology of self compassion. And it's very interesting because self compassionate self talk actually activates parts of our brain, the anterior insula, that help our brain feel the signals coming from inside of our body more clearly and with more accuracy. So we can actually use self compassion to create less threat, better perception of the feelings that we're feeling inside of our own body. And so then the opposite is kind of true with the inner critic, right? The more we have that inner critic voice that is pushing us into dissociation, like you talked about that big triad of shame, dissociation, and freeze, then we are no longer able to hear, or we're really misinterpreting the signals coming from inside of our own body. So the way we actually feel our body changes when that inner critic voice is going. And you might be able to really resonate with that. Like when the inner critic is going, again, even if it's about like your job or this podcast or your money, maybe you feel gross in your body. You feel uncomfortable. You feel like you want to hurt yourself, right? That's when this inner critic voice is really loud. I often see people wanting to self harm, wanting to abuse the body. And there's this real effect on the interoceptive system and the ability to hear what's going on inside of our body and to know where our body is in space and be connected to our body when that inner critic voice is so loud.
And the when I think of boundaries too, the interoceptive system plays such a big role. Your interoception and your exteroception, they are literally your physical living boundaries of your nervous system before you go into the outside world. And so, we've talked about on this podcast so much. I think it was season 3 and season 2 we talk about the insular cortex, because that's one of the key players into your interoceptive system, training your vagus nerve and training your insular cortex, because that insular cortex is responsible for turning emotions into motivation and action. So you can see, if you have a harsh inner critic, how the motivation and action would be turned down, right? You don't have a lot of motivation. You can't take a lot of action when you're frozen and shut down and dissociated. So by working with certain areas of the brain, we can start to implement new action. And when we start turning the survival brain down and going into the higher order systems of thinking, into the prefrontal cortex, working on executive functioning, you're going to see a huge shift in the way that you are showing up in your brain to yourself. And that's where we want to be, right? This is back to the daily nervous system training practice that we talk about every single moment we get on here, right? And offering you the free 2 weeks at rewiretrial.com, so you can come experiencing these tools. Come see if you've got a deficit in your nervous system, like learn that, because you are going to want to know the accuracy of the signals that come from the internal sensations of your body.
Definitely. Interoceptive training, frontal lobe training has been so huge for me in moving out of this inner critic loop cycle. And I want to talk a little bit too about perfectionism and this inner critic, because we have the episode on perfectionism. And if you're resonating with the inner critic, definitely go back and listen to that, because real talk, perfectionism is a trauma response. And it is this hyper vigilant way of trying to control ourselves and control our environment to make sure that we stay safe socially, physically, emotionally. And though it's often like rewarded by our society as being a high performer, people will give you a lot of praise for pushing through your pain and doing so much. You might get rewarded financially, but there are real costs to what that stress level is doing to your body, to keeping you stuck in this trauma response, and to stay living in that experience of being in constant dialogue with the inner critic that's really driving all of that behavior. It's not from our own sense of like desire and purpose, but it's just to escape this. And that is tough. That is a really tough way to live.
Perfectionism is a constant state of high stress. It's a constant self abandonment from your truth and expression, because what is perfect? What are we going for here? Have you ever arrived there? Like, there's no end in sight. Like, you're just going to keep pushing and driving until you don't ever reach something. And think about what that causes for you every day, whether that's like showing up as, what I think about more is hiding, right? What I see a lot of coming through with our clients is that they want higher levels of visibility. They want to use their voices more, but like they just can't. My not until my body looks like this, not until I get this, not until I get here. And then when I get here, I can do this. And it's like, but you're never going to get there to the first stop anyway, because of this driving perfectionism. And learning to let life be messy is really scary in the beginning. It is scary AF to all of a sudden let God, the universe, whatever your words are, to have a little bit more play in your life, to slow down, to rest. These are other components of the opposite of perfectionism. And those are all really scary narratives to push against when you have developed in a way as a little person that says, well, I have to be perfect so that I can maintain attachment in life. What we know from season 3 is all about connection and attachment.
It's such a good example of people being really shut down to take any action because of that perfectionism loop. And yeah, it can drive us in so many ways where we can't actually take any forward momentum in our life because we have to be so perfect before we get there, or it can keep us constantly overdoing, overtraining, overworking, in just these doing loops that are they're going to lead to the outputs of exhaustion. The stress bucket is going to overflow. It's going to lead to maladaptive behaviors because at some point the nervous system is going to need to come down from that state. So you might find yourself binge eating and like you just can't get out of that cycle of overworking, overdoing, and then you have a binge or you drink some alcohol or you use some cannabis or you whatever it is that you're using to make it safe to come out of that state. And it can feel really, really scary to allow yourself to come out of that cycle of whatever behavior it is that you're doing because the inner critic voice is so loud and so harsh. You know that if you don't do the thing, you're going to have to face that inner critic voice that's saying like, you should have done the thing, you're not good enough. And I remember working with a client that had a really difficult time eating food, because of the really loud inner critic voice. And even though we looked at all the ways that the disordered eating was keeping life really small and shutting things down, and the cost to her body and the cost to her social connections, and like cognitively, I got it, I understand, I don't want that. But then knowing if I take the action to move out of this disordered behavior, I'm going to have to face that inner critic. It's going to feel so uncomfortable in my body and my head that in that moment, because again, survival brain lives in the moment, the stress of the dysregulation and the shame that would come from taking the new action was so big and overwhelming. We just couldn't push past that to take the new action.
I think it's a really important point on perfectionism that that someone with perfectionism could have a driving, overdoing response and a total shutdown response at the same time from the same response. And all of this, what we're talking about, can also lead to some really compulsive behaviors. Where we plan on recording a conversation on OCD in season 4. Disordered eating we'll explore more in season 4 as well. But that is definitely one of the compulsive behaviors that I found myself in as I was driving against some of these reflexive responses. Well, it was food, alcohol, and cannabis at one time. Some of them at multiple times altogether and one at a time. And so, that's not really the way to live in a high stress response and then just using something to shut you down also, right? Like this is what the tools do. They start to regulate us to be able to come out of these high stress states every day in a moment by moment basis and situational experiences on a situational basis. And, these compulsions, they're sort of this way to try and control the body, control the environment to feel safe. But that is a never ending need that gets met because the safety never comes. And like we're saying, like, are you high driving perfectionists? Are you shutting down perfectionists? Like the inner critic is going to drive us in so many different directions, but without something that really makes us feel safe, we're never going to feel the safety. And that's the beauty of working with your nervous system.
That's right. It's just like that little kid developing in that high stress environment, trying to change themselves through the inner criticism to get their needs met. If that safety is coming externally, even now in adulthood, we're just chasing it. And we're never creating the internal environment of safety that allows us to have that moment of realization. And so the self criticism and the perfectionism and those driving behaviors just go on and on and on. And until we have the tools and the ways to create that safety internally, we can't stop. And then there's another huge component of this, kind of the sibling of the internal critic, the external critic, right? Another component of the same thing. It's the flip side of the coin, but it's another protective response. One is like pushing inward to stay safe and try to create change there, and the other is pushing outward. But they're both reflexive mechanisms that change the way our brain is taking in information, filtering information about the world around us, about our relationships, about other people, about ourselves. And it comes from a need to secure safety, always physical, emotional, or social safety. And so we can have a very loud external critic too that is putting that same lens of not enough and distrust onto other people around us all of the time because we don't feel safe with those social connections.
It's interesting, as a content creator, as someone on social media, back to, people not wanting to be seen on social media for fear of like how people will respond to you. And what we see a lot is the external critic online. You can look on there at any time and just go through a post and listen to another person shame, degrade in some way online, telling somebody that they're wrong, they're dumb, you're stupid, you're fat, you're ugly. I mean, it's happened to me before. And it's like, you're experiencing the inner critic of someone else, as your inner critic is also like you're shutting your inner critic down so that you can show up, you can be visible, be authentic. And then at the same time, we are being exposed to someone else's inner critic that's gone wild into their external critic. And that inner critic, that voice in our head is oftentimes showing us what we could be most afraid of, right? And back to visibility, to love, to worthiness, right? The things that we want the most, often that inner critic is in there telling us, like, no, you don't deserve this. You are not good enough for this. And then here comes the external critic of somebody else actually coming at us and saying those things. And is another really beautiful thing about learning the nervous system is you start to learn other people's nervous system.
Totally. So I want to circle back to the social media thing in a second, but yeah, that reflexive response, it's like when we are so afraid of intimacy or connection or really allowing ourselves to be vulnerable and possibly hurt socially, when a relationship expands into more depths, we might find that external critic kick on as well. Like there's part of us inside that's saying I don't deserve this, but then there's another part that's hyper vigilant about all the ways we're going to get hurt or this person's going to let us down or disappoint us, and we start to pick that apart. I've found it when I'm working even with other professionals, like when I'm vulnerable, like with a neuro coach or with a somatic therapist or something, when the container gets too deep, I will go into pulling back myself, and I'll also start pushing out with external criticism about why it's not right for me and all these things, right? And then when you were talking about social media, I couldn't help but think about your grief reel that went viral. And it was a very vulnerable post and it showed a lot of emotional expression. And that is scary for people, right? People are scared of expressing emotions, watching somebody else express it, that calling that it has to them themselves to express it, the emotion that it might bring up in them to see someone grieving. If that emotion of grief is scary, there's a big response there. There was a lot of external criticism response. And the external critic absolutely can be protecting us from deeper emotions like shame or grief. And we get hypercritical of others to protect ourselves from experiencing those emotions, from abandonment, or from even like when a relationship is pulling up those emotions in us, when a connection with someone else is pulling up those emotions in us, and we don't want to feel our own shame, anger, grief, whatever it is, that external critic will come out to protect us.
Look at gossip, right? Look at gossip. That's external critic engaging in social connection. That's that's not great. everybody. Like that is not that's not nice. Back to, what I think of when I think of the external critic too, and like it's this, when people talk about other people's weight and then they put it as like, "Oh, I'm just concerned for you," or "I'm scared of what could happen to you like through your body weight." And like that's how I think about it, and it's like, no, you have fears around yourself. You have an inner critic around your body because how you feel about such and such's body is a reflection of how you're feeling about the body. But just think of any time you're engaged in gossip. What's going on there? That is your external critic alive and out there.
Totally. Totally. It's it's really fascinating to explore, and when mine does come out, I have a much louder inner critic than external critic because I'm so conflict averse, I think. But sometimes it does come out, and in my thoughts, never really in my I'm never very vocal about it, but in my thoughts, it will protect me in relationship, and it's really interesting to have this awareness because I can know when those things start to come up, oh, this might not be an accurate reflection of how I really feel about this person, this relationship, this container. It is likely that I'm feeling threatened by something that's happening here and it's pushed me into this reflexive response. And so that kind of brings us to like what can we do about all of this now that we are seeing it? What do we do when we know that we have this reflexive protective trauma response? And the first step always is the awareness, just that understanding of knowing that when the loops start to play, it's just a loop. It's just a well worn protective path that has been activated by a trigger. It's not real. It's not my actual beliefs about myself. It's probably not my actual beliefs about the other person. And it's definitely not objectively true. It's just the filtering system that my brain has, and it only feels true in that moment because it's how I feel inside. It's not it's not real.
And it's important to start cultivating some self-compassion, and that's when you can catch when you can catch the awareness, you can start to have some self-compassion. You can regulate your nervous system, use some of your high reward payoff tools, and start developing a relationship with yourself, right? Relationship through I did used to have a strong external critic, particularly when I was growing up and in my teenage years and in my 20s when I was drinking a lot. Everyone else was wrong, but never me. Everyone else was wrong. I did not understand how to take any responsibility for my nervous system. And I sought so much external validation at the same time in so many ways from people and like didn't understand how to trust myself. So part of understanding how to trust myself was understanding like what are the thoughts coming through my mind? Is this real? Like we were talking about it being disproportionate earlier. Like how wild is this thread going in my head? This is getting really disproportionate. I can catch myself. I can catch that and be like, okay, I can have a cognitive conversation with myself. I can stomp around. I can move my body, have some somatic expression, do some intentional training in my higher order systems of thinking, in my prefrontal cortex. Like that's really important for people to understand. You can, if you get hijacked, you can get control right back over that of your brain.
Yeah, using those practical, actionable tools is a really big deal. And then just to taking the reframe a little bit deeper even is that I think sometimes we might even be willing to say like, okay, this is just a reflexive protective trauma response of a well-worn loop, but there's some truth to this loop. Like there's something about it that's true about me, because I've heard it so many times that it actually has kind of become baked into my beliefs about myself. And really taking a moment to understand this is a loop that is just a reflection of your fears, of your social connections being severed. It is nothing that has anything to do with how you actually are. It's only your what you're afraid of, the things that you think would separate you from other people, cause you to be abandoned or rejected. It's those fears given a voice. And so it's just a reflection of your fears and nothing about your actual behavior or way of being in the world.
That's so empowering. My, my outline is cut off, so I don't know if I'm missing anything.
I think we were just going to touch on the drills one more time.
Okay.
So,
So, we talked earlier about the interoceptive system and, working with the insular cortex and the vagus nerve, right? And learning what your nervous system needs, what it wants, and how to communicate with it. And the language of the nervous system is through sensory inputs. It's not a cognitive conversation. That's why we train our sensory systems intentionally each day. And, one of the drills that I feel like I talked about a lot through season 2 for me was sensory stimulus and understanding like where my body is, what it is, where are the boundaries and starting to love on the parts that I was so critical about before.
yeah, again, just having that practice of those practical tools that speak the language of the nervous system. So it definitely really does help to join us on rewiretrial.com and start getting those tools. And then the emotional processing practices too, right? Remember, if these are protective and they're protecting us from these big emotions that we don't know how to move through the body, that we've repressed or suppressed for so long, we have to also start developing the skills to process those emotions and emotionally regulate so that we don't go into these reflexive responses every time we experience the emotion. And so we do a lot of emotional processing on the site, shame processing, fear processing, being able to process joy, all of these things, and really making some time to re educate your nervous system and do it with us in community or find some way to do it so that you don't have to go back into these responses.
Yeah, there's another way to be. You don't have to experience the world the way that you may be experiencing it today as you're taking in this podcast and this information. Like, there's a whole other way out there. And I'm sure that you dream of it, you have dreamt of it, and that's all possible through your nervous system. So please join us at rewiretrial.com and we'll see you next week when we explore toxic shame.